it's not a watch that arrives in like, a baggie from Alibaba, which does not, by the way, I don't think it professes to be a luxury good.
No, not at all.
That is a very accurate description of how both of my San Martins arrived. This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California, and we are thrilled to announce that Collective is now an authorized retailer of both Ming and Sartori Biard, both design-driven rising stars of the independent watch world. In fact, the week this episode releases, we'll be hosting a number of hands-on events with Ming in Los Angeles and San Francisco on February 4th and 6th, respectively. Both the Ming and Collective teams will be present to take you through the brand's collection, from the GPHG-winning Bluefin dive watch to their most complicated pieces. To learn more about Sartori Biard, Ming, and those events, visit collectivehorology.com.
Homages, replicas, clones, super clones, dupes, oh my. Today we are digging into the business and ethics of what's a perennial and now growing segment of the watch market. This is a complex topic with important distinctions to be drawn between homages, replicas, clones, and everything else. And more broadly, it's one that sheds important light on technology and production gains across the industry globally. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, today we have the perfect guest to guide us through that landscape, Marc Frankel, who most of you probably know as Marc from Long Island Watch, both a retailer and a manufacturer of a wide range of watches, including Homage watches. Marc is not only a living legend in this industry, but someone that we genuinely admire and like, and we are both proud and happy customers of Long Island Watch. And one of the great joys for us in participating in the Wind Up Watch Fairs over the years has been getting to know Marc. So it's good to see you, man. Welcome to Open Work.
Thanks for having me.
So Marc, why don't we start with just definitions before we get involved? Because I think a lot of words like homage, replica, clone, there's a million of them. They kind of get used, maybe not interchangeably, but there's some important distinctions. And I think we should just like agree on terms for ourselves, but really for the audience before we start. So what do you think are the differences between, say, an homage watch and something that might be defined as like a replica, a clone, a fake, or whatever?
So, in my opinion, what I think is a replica, a clone, a fake, they're kind of all the same thing. I do know that like down in like replica land, like the rep time subreddits and stuff, they really like grade their clones and stuff and super clones and this and that. But to me, any of those replica, clone, fake is a watch that copies a design 100%, every nook and cranny, and also copies the brand name. Okay. An homage would be something that I hesitate to say copy 100%, but it could be. And then it just has a different brand name on it. Therefore, kind of trademark, unless the design is trademarked, which it's rare, trademark kind of gets out of the way. And it's a way, I would say, for people to get the look for less, especially I would guess in the things that you deal with, right? Certainly higher end timepieces. And you mentioned in the beginning, Ming. Ming's a perfect example, right? I mean, you could make a Ming homage for not a lot of money. It wouldn't be the same on the inside, obviously, in the craftsmanship. But for somebody that wants a Ming that doesn't want to spend $5,000 or $6,000, an homage would be a perfect entry point.
Let me ask you a question about that
Sure.
has always sort of, well, frankly, it's always really bothered me. And I'm curious for your point of view on it. Part of the reason a watch costs what it costs is because there's sweat equity in that watch, right?
Absolutely.
And if a brand, and I'll give an example. So there are, and I'm not going to shine light on the person who does the replica or the clone or what have you, but Urwerk, a brand that we love, there are many other brands out there right now that are replicating very closely a lot of their design, and they're doing it for a lot less money than what an actual Urwerk costs. And we can, putting aside the reality of like the finishing, the production, and the movements and all of that, the designs are very clear and are very clearly borrowed or stolen, however you want to put it, but taken.
Sure.
Part of the reason that they can do that for such a low price is because there was no sweat equity there. They photocopied, they didn't invent. So
correct.
In the context of a replica, where do you think we can draw an ethical line between something being an homage or a replica that someone should feel good about buying versus something that is if we look at it from the intellectual property standpoint, really kind of disconcerting? Or is there no line there?
I'm going to try to imagine where you're going. So Urwerk is a great example. The clones of Urwerk, though, their operation is nothing like an Urwerk. They tell time similar, but the mechanism on the inside is totally different. I think I own one of these. And, I kind of looked at it from the perspective of an engineer. And I'm like, how are they doing this? And the way they're doing it is really smart. Bunch of carriages, a little pin, blah, blah, blah. I agree with you. I understand what you're saying. But I also think that the person who's going to buy an Urwerk would never buy one of these other ones. I don't think it's saturating or diluting the market at all. So I understand the ethical concern of what you're asking, but I can say the same thing about a Rolex Submariner, right? Probably the most duplicated or replicated watch out there.
I am actually wearing a Rolex Homage right now. One of our few wrist checks. It's a San Martin Kermit.
Okay.
And
so perfect.
I bought it actually to demo wearing a Rolex Submariner with a green bezel to see if it's something I could do every day.
That's what a lot of people do. I think in the Urwerk category, it's just a totally different animal because there's so much more going on the inside. But for something like a subby, right? I mean, what are you duplicating? It's a case, a dial, and a movement. It's the vertical integration. It's everything about Rolex as a company that makes the watch worth it. It's the name on it. Now, if that Sam Martin said Rolex, well, then now, it's not a Rolex. It's a different story. It's like the guy driving the train being called an engineer. I'm like, well, he's not an engineer.
It's so interesting hearing you say this because I'm trying to explore my feelings about it to get to the core of it because I want to talk about your business or the business of this rather.
Sure.
And on the one hand, I look at it, I'm like, well, maybe part of it is that I know the Urwerk guys, so I feel defensive in that regard, right?
Thing.
Yeah, and then there's the other side of it too, which is they're a much smaller company than say Rolex, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, saying well, you can make an homage to a big company because they won't notice, but a small company's not okay. It's not the way the law works. So, you can't apply such a structure to it.
Yeah. But Asher, I want to remind you just quickly of something.
Yeah.
Which is when you and I went to visit the Urwerk Atelier in Old Town Geneva, one of the first things that Felix drew our attention to was in their conference room was one of the first known examples of a wandering hours
I see where you're going
clock.
with this.
And this is, I think it's a 16th century wall clock that was apparently a gift to a pope. And it's one of the first known examples of time telling using a wandering hours display,
right?
Which is what Urwerk uses in pretty much all of their watches in one way or another. And Felix and Martin at Urwerk are very open in saying their fundamental idea for time telling was inspired by these old wandering hours clocks. Now, that's an homage. On some level, every watch, I think there's a clear line in the sand between, words like replica, clone, fake, dupe, and an homage, right? It's like Marc pointed out. It's if you're making a replica watch, you're taking everything, including the brand, which is trademarked, and the ethical issues aside, legally it's trademarked, and you're creating a copy of it. An homage, you could be making a very close version of it. I mean, arguably, this San Martin is an homage. I have another San Martin here, Asher, which I showed you earlier today, which is their Black Bay Pro watch, which is actually less of a copy, and it's more of their take on that. That's an homage. That's pretty close in, but on some level, any watch that tells time has drawn inspiration from something else. So going back to Urwerk, do they owe some kind of royalty, or is there some sort of ethical problem with the fact that they took their key design and their signature design around which they've built their business from an existing time-telling format and design? Do they owe it some kind of royalty to the family of the clockmaker who pioneered the wandering hour display? Where do you draw the line, I guess is what I'm saying, once we're in the world of homages.
It's funny you should mention this and that you invited me on to talk about this, because I actually am going to do a video really soon about fakes, because when I bought, this is a Casio G-Shock. It's called a manga edition. It's based off of Japanese animation. And I really wanted one because a guy on Instagram had one. And I was like, damn, I really like that watch. And they're like kind of sold out. It's a Japanese model. And I Googled it and I got AliExpress. And except it was, instead of G-Shock, it was G-Shoyu. It was like spelled wrong, but everything about it was the same. And I'm like, what the hell, whatever. Even when I did a video on the watch. I actually showed that. And then afterwards, I'm like, you know what? I want to buy this thing. So I bought it. It's like $20. I got it. It actually says G-Shock on it. Yeah. It's just a little bit of a different color blue. And then I was like, I found a Brew watch. I said to Jonathan, I said, you see these? And he goes, yeah. And he tells me the whole story. He's been fighting it, blah, blah, blah. So I ordered the Brew watch. And then I see a Seiko Patty Diver, which sells for $500. I see it for $90-something. I bought that. So I'm going to do a video on all three of these fakes and, kind of see what the difference is. But those are fakes. Those are replicas. Those are clones. Those are, kind of shameless, 100% shameless. They're just 100% copying design and name, which is, there's no excuse for copying name. You want to rip the name off or call it something different. I mean, legally, it's fine. And, legalities is something big that, a lot of people chime in on with me. And they're like, well, how can what you do be legal? Especially, with some of the early Islanders, it's Seiko's copyright. And people that say that clearly have no idea what copyright, trademark, patent, any of that stuff is. It's not. Rolex's patent on the trip lock crown ran out 40 years ago. Oyster case, 50 years ago. But the trademark is in perpetuity. You just can't call it that. So I think that's also a lot of kind of what the misconstruing or misconstruction is in the whole replica game.
Okay, so that's actually a really interesting point. So in the context of Rolex, let's talk about that. And with like the San Martin is what you're wearing, Gabe?
Oh yeah, don't get it twisted, man. These watches are genuinely impressive for what they offer.
So this is what I want to get into. So if I'm understanding you correctly, Mark, what you're basically saying is the patent on a specific crown threading or on the way that a case is constructed, etc. If we were to look at that as it relates to, and I'm sure that there's all sorts of legal trickeries around this, where it's like you can make a minor adjustment and refile a trademark, and it's like 99.99% the same, but whatever. But assuming you, well, hang on.
Well, now Asher, you just put trademark and patent in a blender.
I mean, that's why I'm waiting to finish.
So what I'm trying to get at is, let's look at that San Martin. Let's assume that San Martin uses an expired patent to replicate a specific style of oyster case. Okay. Mm-hmm. In that instance, it is essentially completely legal what they're doing, and arguably like there is no ethical quagmire there because it's completely legal. The question and the line that you drew, which I find really interesting, is like, well, that's that doesn't claim to be a Rolex. It's not. It might look like one, but it's not. It doesn't. Any reasonable person could hold it in their hand and say this is not a Rolex because it literally doesn't say so. And in which case, it kind of checks that box of homage. But and we can get into how impressive it is from a machining standpoint. But what you talked about was really interesting there, where it's like you ordered something that was kind of like a little bit of a reach around, where somebody said, "Well, this is not a G-Shock, it's a G-Shoyu."
Right.
But then it showed up and it actually said G-Shock on it.
Yep.
In which case it was a bit of a bait and switch, where they were kind of using like a little bit of a fig leaf to get you to think like, okay, I know what I'm getting here.
Yeah.
I'm buying the Kobe, not the Sony. But then I actually opened the box and it's a Sony.
I got a Sony.
Well, Sony.
That's exactly what I got. And, it was kind of surprising to me that when I opened the box, it said G-Shock on it. Oh, it didn't come in a box, I should say. It came in a little bubble wrap sleeve. And it came from China faster than I can ship a watch to New Jersey from my office in New York, which is kind of insane.
Well, so that's an interesting point too, to put in the context of the production quality of the watch, because the one you're wearing, Gabe, right now was made in China, right?
Yes, San Martin made in China.
So let's talk a little bit about like, I mean, you've been singing the praises of this watch to me now for a couple of days, and I'm curious. Can you just talk a little bit about what you mean when you say it's built really well?
Oh, sure. And I know Marc is going to have probably just as much, if not more, to say than I will on this. But I've got two San Martin watches right here. I've got that Kermit on my wrist. And as I mentioned, I also got this Black Bay Pro kind of knockoff, which I'm even more impressed with, actually. When I say they're built really well, I think to put in context how much I paid for this, it was about $200 each. I can't remember exactly, but let's say that these are in the neighborhood of $200 to $300.
Yeah.
And if this was, forget that Tudor Submariners and Black Bay Pros, forget that Rolex Submariners and Black Bay Pros exist in the world. Just somehow suspend disbelief and erase those two brands and those watches from existence. If we went to a wind-up watch fair and saw these two watches sitting at a booth under the San Martin brand, made the way they are, people would be really impressed with what you're getting. So these are stainless steel watches, 316L stainless steel, so not 904L. They have a really well-built bracelet. So they're an oyster bracelet. The clasp is also milled. It's a little bit different it's very different than an oyster or a, whatever they flip-lock clasps that Rolex makes. But it's a fully milled clasp, really impressive. They make ones that have on-the-fly micro adjustment. The case is similar proportions to a Rolex or a Tudor, well finished.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure if I looped it, I could see some differences, but for all intents and purposes, just about as well finished. I will say the sub is not quite as well finished as the Black Bay knockoff. The case is a little sharp, but the case lines on this Black Bay version are great. And the finishing is really nice. It's comfortable. This is kind of like a Goldilocks version, to be honest, of a Tudor Black Bay. The case is about 40 millimeters. It's thinner, though. It's about 12 millimeters thick. So it's a lot thinner rather than the Black Bay Pro. It has no rivets on the bracelet. So it's kind of like the enthusiast's version of a Black Bay Pro. Like all the things you see enthusiasts saying they want this watch has. And just the bottom line, for a watch that's $200 to $300, these feel really well made. And again, if they were at any watch fair or lined up against anything else, enthusiasts would be singing their praises. You know, I expected, and I know the landscape is a bit checkered. And Marc, you've probably thought about and looked at more of these brands than I have, but like San Martin, I think has a particularly strong reputation around finishing. And I should also say these use Seiko movements within, but I know that it's like a mixed bag with these brands. There's a lot of them, and some of them the finishing is rougher than the others. But I think relative to what you're getting from those other brands and the price, what San Martin in particular is offering is really, really quite compelling. But
right.
I think, Marc, look, you wholesale San Martin, so you retail them and you wholesale watches from them. You do business with them on a business to business level. There are other Homage brands that you stock. I'm sure there are plenty that you look at that you've considered and said no to. I'm kind of curious, like from your perspective, what is the landscape? And in particular, I think what we're talking about now are these Chinese Homage brands, whether they're San Martin or Pagani or the others. What is kind of the landscape of those brands? Are all of them offering a tremendous amount of quality? Is it a mixed bag? Like, what does that corner of the market look like?
Wherever they're made, right? So they're probably not making the cases. San Martin is coming from a case manufacturer. You know, I think San Martin put them to be more of an assembler, I guess, just like most watch manufacturers are. When you specify parts, you know, you can specify, for lack of a better term, the grade that you want. Is it going to go into a cheap imitation? Well, then that's, kind of the cheapo one. But you can get really, really, as you can see, nicely finished cases. They're, finishing, believe it or not, is still hand done. This is all still done by hand with guys with finger cots or girls pressing them into a machine. But it's not the, I think in the American perception is sweatshop, not safe, dismal conditions. And from what I see from the factories that send me footage, it's really anything but. It's state of the art. It is well lit. People, they work their asses off for sure. But, cost of living and everything else is just a different animal overseas than it is here. So I can't speak for what they're being paid, but you can get some amazing, amazing stuff. And the adage from the 70s and 80s of just Chinese garbage is just simply not, it's basically not true. You can get Chinese garbage if you want, but there are plenty of manufacturers that are making nicer stuff. San Martin started out, as you said, in the homage business, and they have, slowly started with their own designs. It's kind of like me. It's a path you can almost never outrun because people will always know you as that, but that's where they're progressing. Whereas something like, I don't follow them too much, but like Pagani, you had mentioned, they're basically just taking a Nautilus, an Aquanaut, or this or that, and just putting their own name on it. And, much to, what Asher was saying before, there was a lot of sweat equity that went into the design of an Aquanaut or a Nautilus, and you're just copying it. But I'll say in the same sentence, not everyone can spend 40 grand on a watch. They'll spend 150 and they'll be just as happy. But yeah, I think a lot of those brands are still kind of doing that. I want to call it is an homage. It is a ripoff, if you will, because there's not much going on. But yeah, I can see the point, and I understand it.
So it's interesting because as a side point, I'm trying to like also just do a little bit of like self-exploration on that, and I'm like, well, I care a lot about watches, right? Like watches are how I make my living, and there's an art form I love. But but there's plenty of, I also like photography. There's plenty of photographs that I've purchased or printed out that I didn't get an official print of. And arguably, that's following the same path. I just don't care as much about photography as I do about watches. So I'm applying a much heavier like moral finger waggy tone to something that I personally care a lot more about, but is still artistic.
And that's okay. There's a difference between what's legal, right, and what's moral or ethical, right? And I think we can debate.
Oh yeah.
Just because a watch design can't legally be trademarked, right? Like the dial design of a watch can't be trademarked, and it can be used, and the logo or the brand name is a thing that is illegal to copy.
The Tudor is enforcing the snowflake thing everywhere. If there's any watch with snowflake hands, even if you don't say snowflake, they are coming after you.
But I think my point is, I think it's fair and reasonable to debate this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And humans will debate it till the end of time.
Yeah. All right. So I want to get deeper into that. All right. So we acknowledge some of the murky quagmire component of it. And I think it was helpful to define the differences between, say, a trademark and a patent. But one of our most popular episodes recently, and one that's really stuck with me, is the conversation we had with Wes Kwok from Notice, who of course does a ton of production in China himself. And it's very eye-opening just for me in general, and it begs some really interesting questions. As someone who works with a lot of brand or a lot of companies that are doing business there, you just spoke a little bit about the working conditions. I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of talent and production quality there as well. Because it's one thing to have people assembling things, but capable and talented craftspeople is one thing. And I'm curious, are there any novel technical approaches or aesthetic flourishes that you are seeing coming out of the market that we don't generally see from more traditional watchmaking markets?
I think there's a lot of different ways you could attack it. I know a few days ago I had sent you something that just happened to come across my radar, and they're making modules just like DD would that'll mount on a cheapo Miyota movement and turn it into something that, I don't know, tracks second time zone, turns into a chronograph, whatever. The technology is there. Seagull, who you guys know who Seagull is, Tianjin Watch Company, they just came out. I'm tempted to buy one a few weeks ago with a Ratrapan, their own Ratrapan for like $3,500. And it's beautiful. And it's a real split seconds chrono that they make in China. Now, I'm sure it's a rip of someone else's movement, but you really can't make a Ratrapan cheaply, because if the components aren't working together, in harmony, it's unforgiving. It's just simply not going to work.
Well, I'm also listening to you speak, and I'm like, it's kind of interesting there too, because I think sometimes, and this is something that we hear all the time when people, crap on CNC machine work, right? Mm-hmm. Where there's this belief that like you buy a CNC machine and you like hit the make watch button and out, comes something, which of course is ridiculous. Like being a machinist is as much a skill as any other art form.
Right.
And what I'm hearing you say is, all right, let's assume for a minute, and we don't know if this is true, right? But let's assume for a minute that the movement architecture they're working with is not intellectual property that was unique to them.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't belie the talent and skill that's necessary to manufacture that and then ultimately make it a functional and ideally robust timepiece. So that in of itself is a skill.
The real, like the workhorse of the Seagull fleet, the ST-19 movement, the one that, the watermelon guy, Studio Underdog, the movement that he uses, that is a Venus 175 made on the equipment that, Tianjian bought from the Swiss, 70 years ago. And they figured out how to cheaply mass produce that movement and make it, for a mechanical chronograph, I would say relatively reliable, because we sell watches with that movement in it. And it's quite amazing what they can do. Yeah. So just because, like you said, duplicate is not just click duplicate. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of engineering that goes on in the background, figuring out how to make something, how to make it robust, how to make it reliable, how to make it durable, that doesn't break inside of 2 hours.
So what's the criteria you use when you think about bringing a brand into the store when you are looking at something that falls into the category of watches we're talking about?
Oh, well, that's, user sentiment. There's usually not a brand first starting out that I don't think so, that would kind of get in contact with me and say they're looking to sell watches. I look for user sentiment, design prowess, something different, just not the same old thing. A lot of people think that you design a watch and you click a button, you put it on the website and people are going to buy it, and nothing could be further from the
only.
truth. It doesn't work that way, quite surprisingly. I joke, but I do feel it's true. If I would have launched Islander without Long Island Watch being around for 15 years, I don't think the brand would have been successful. I happen to have a platform to push it on, and 15 years of people trusting me to sell them something good. But to answer your question, it just has to speak to me, has to be nice, has to be something I want different. It doesn't have to be different as far as, I just don't want another Rolex sub clone. It's just not my thing. It's overdone. I need something different. It has to have good value. And then, like I said, good sentiment. You read online, you read whatever you want. Generally find out what people are saying. And that's usually the truth, more than not.
You mentioned sentiment as like a gauge to figure out like, oh, am I going to bring this in? Is this a brand that, I see some early interest in among, my customer base, things like that. But I would presume, all told, you're bringing watches in, whether it's an Homage watch or anything, because of its economics, the belief that it will sell well and support your business, support your team, be something commercially that people actually do want to buy, sentiment aside. So I guess from your perspective, you run a whale of an online watch retail operation. You have many brands across a variety of price points. You're looking at all corners of the market. You're carrying stuff that's made in Switzerland and Japan and China and many other places. How big of a business from your perspective are Homage watches? I would imagine you stock them because they sell. And the reason I ask is we can debate the legality of it. We can certainly debate, and we should debate, the questions around the ethics of it. But people vote with their wallets. And when it comes to the business of Homage watches, like, how big of a business is it? Are these watches that are popular from a sales standpoint?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and yes. And it's clear to me that, if you have an ethical dilemma with it, then, that's fine. But as you said, people vote with their wallets. And, if you could do a sub-E style or a Seamaster style or whatever at far less than what someone's going to spend, they buy. I would say that, in my store, what percentage are homages? Probably not a lot. By SKU count, definitely not a lot. It's probably less than 5 to 10%. But people will buy them in troves and volumes. You know why? Because to the uninitiated, that is what a watch is. To someone not in watches, let's walk down the street and let's find 10 people and say, name the first watch that comes to your mind. Are they going to say a Ming? Are they going to say a Vacheron Constantin? No. they're going to say Rolex. They might say Citizen, but they're going to say Rolex, Omega, and that might be the end of the conversation. Because those are the two brands, or some of the two brands that, advertise the most and are in people's minds. And if you're trying to convert someone, or someone thinks they're going to buy a watch, or their husband says or wife says, I want a new watch, well, that's the name that comes to mind. And if you could find something getting the look for less, as I like to call it, I think people are going to flock to it. They do.
I think that's a really good point. Like, to the uninitiated, a lot of watches just happen to look like a Rolex Submariner. And that's not just true now. I mean, if you think historically, right? Like, think to the 1920s and 30s. So many wristwatches from that era were rectangular.
Yes.
That was kind of what was in the air at that moment. And then, in the mid-century, in the 50s, really before sport watches took off,
mm-hmm.
round, circular dress watches, small watches. That was just what a watch was. And I think now, more broadly, culturally, like, what a watch is just kind of something that looks like a Submariner. It's probably no coincidence that the Trump watch, for instance, is basically a Submariner design, because to the uninitiated, like, a gold Submariner is just a nice watch, right? It's just easy to communicate. This is a watch. This is premium. This is desirable. It's automatic.
Mm-hmm.
It's Swiss. All, like, the Rolex design is just a shorthand,
right,
for all of that.
Correct.
In a way. But I guess, in terms of the popularity of them, there's two ways to look at it. As Asher would like to say, playing the role of the cynic and the pragmatist. We haven't done that one in a while. The cynical version of it is like, okay, this is just lazy. Right? It's unoriginal. It's uninspired. Blah. I'm out. The more kind of pragmatic, or maybe the more interesting way of thinking about it might be, well, these watches are helping to subsidize things that are more interesting. So you talked about all of the production gains in China, and we talked about that with Wes Kwok as well. Just how far Chinese manufacturing has come, which I would argue is probably good for the watch industry overall. Like, having competition, having other centers of excellence in the world beyond Switzerland and Japan is a good thing for watches overall. Having brands and companies that are willing to push what's possible in terms of materials or even cost to produce, or
mm-hmm.
things like that is a good thing. I mean, one way to look at this is these more homage driven watches are helping subsidize an industry in China that is growing rapidly, that is pushing its own quality, and therefore ultimately pushing the quality of the industry. Because, of course, this is an arms race. It's like counterfeiting money, right? The better the counterfeiters get, the better the mint has to get at creating real currency, right? So presumably what this then forces someone like a Rolex or an Omega to do is figure out, okay, if San Martin or its suppliers can produce an amazing ceramic bezel, that's now the floor.
So that's perfect. It's a perfect example, right? So when you were playing with your San Martin before, I was going to say, so what's the crystal made out of? Sapphire, right? Is it a ceramic bezel insert?
Sure is.
So let's go to I have one upstairs. So a mid-80s Datejust, my dad's Datejust. What's the crystal? It's acrylic.
Mm-hmm.
What's the bracelet? It's hollow. What's the clasp? It's a piece of shit folded clasp. Excuse me. Piece of garbage folded clasp.
Oh, you're good.
The end links, hollow and folded over. I mean, these are things that if Rolex came out with them today, people would laugh them under the table. But that was industry standard. Seiko takes a lot of heat still, because on most of their watches, they still do not offer sapphire. It's still a hard Lex, so hard Lex is basically their quote unquote mineral crystal. They only started using sapphire in their regular lines like Pro Specs within the last couple of years. And when they do, they charge enormously for it. Ditto for ceramic. When I went on one of my trips to Seiko in Mawa, they're kind of floored that we can use ceramic and sapphire in a watch and still keep it relatively affordable and still have decent margins. So, much to your point of what you were saying, it kind of makes it need to be better, because look what you can get now. That San Martin's got milled end links. It's got screws in the bracelet. The clear clasp, that freaking clasp is amazing with the push button on the inside. crazy. So what's it? So I'll take it back. It comes full circle. So now what's the benefit of that over a true Kermit?
Well, let's go even further than that. I'm curious to know, in your either literal or proverbial travels through this segment of the industry, are you seeing a larger or increase? Well, two parts. One, are you seeing the luxury market, so the traditional sort of Swiss, German, et cetera, companies leaning more heavily on the supply chain that are in these factories? And has that increased, if so, or not so much? So I'm wondering, like, if these folks are able to produce this at this quality and at this level, from speaking utterly pragmatically, you got to imagine that the folks who work for these large holding companies, they consume them or they can use them or both.
Well, I mean, let's be honest, right? Most of your fine Swiss watches, the bracelets are coming out of China. They're allowed to. It doesn't even come into the FHS rule for 60%. The bracelet is off the table. It's just the head and everything that's in it. So you can have the links, the end links. It's insane what I pay for a fully milled bracelet out of China is crazy. And to think that if I had to make that, forget Switzerland, let's make it in America. Let's mill each link on an NC, thread it, screws, everything, be $1,000 bracelet. It's insane. So yeah, I think that they are kind of, is the horse pushing the cart? I don't know. It's a good point. Is this only happening because they're producing for some of the higher end people, or because they're trying to imitate the higher end people? It could be a little bit of both.
Well, it also sort of begs some other kind of interesting questions too, which says, all right, let's say, for example, that that ability and talent is not region specific, right? You can be an amazing machinist anywhere in the world with the right equipment and the know-how and ability.
Absolutely.
So if you're an amazing machinist anywhere in the world on, let's say, the exact same Kern machine, or I mean, I don't know, maybe there's replica Kerns too, but on the same CNC machine, you are essentially the same. And I realize, like, I don't pit, no one light me up here or light me up. I don't know. Maybe you are exactly the same. So if that's the reality, then what people compete on changes, because you're not saying like, well, only the finest bracelet can come out of location A, B, or C.
There's something else that you need to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, that's really interesting, because what it suggests is that the battlefield might actually become more of a marketplace of ideas and less of a like flag of like, well, we have the machines and the people, so we're the only ones that can do it. Well, that's not true anymore. That's done.
Right.
So if that's done, then it has to become a marketplace of ideas, arguably.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really kind of interesting. So who's got them? Who's more creative? Who's more innovative?
Both are. I think everyone is. We're all, to get sentimental, we're all humans. There's smart people in the US, no doubt. There's really, really smart people that work at Apple. But there's really, really smart people in China. They just don't, maybe they work for Apple, over in China. But, I think it's more about the ecosystem that you're around in and what you have access to. I mean, they just said China just copied a stealth fighter. I mean, we've been working on stealth things for decades. It's not, anyone can do it. As long as the infrastructure exists.
It's so interesting. Our last podcast was with a writer named Catherine Zarella, who writes on the fashion and luxury industry. And she wrote this guest essay in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that was this sort of shot across the bow at the luxury industry for years of unabated price increases, and price increases that exceeded inflation. Now, she wasn't really talking about watches, although a lot of the things she was talking about are owned by the same companies.
Sure.
But she was really talking about fashion and like fine leather goods and things like that. And what forced her to pen this letter was not just being sick and tired of price increases, but a pair of what were supposed to be really nice Marc Jacobs heels that she saved up for that just snapped on her. And her point was what's particularly painful for people who are consuming other luxury products is they're paying more and more and more, and the quality is not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. Now, what I see as kind of the saving grace of a lot of this is it's insulating the watch industry from that problem, which is we can, of course, talk about price increases till we're blue in the face. But I think we can all agree that watches, unlike maybe handbags or heels, have actually gotten better just in the last few years, and certainly in the last 10 years, right?
I agree.
Everything keeps getting better across the board. And when I do think about like, well, are these fake Submariners and Seamasters forcing Tudor and Rolex and Omega to up their game? And are they? They certainly are. I mean, you look at every new release that comes from these brands are continually improving their value proposition, price aside.
Yes.
So I think in some ways, like, again, not only is it good for, say, San Martin that they can do a business in Homage watches,
right? Because
it then for San Martin also allows them, as you've pointed out, to pursue some original designs,
right,
which use stock and are cool watches. But it ends up being good for the industry overall, and in particular, some of the brands that they're copying if they rise to the occasion. Because we now, as watch enthusiasts, are getting some of the best quality, most technologically advanced stuff we ever have. And it doesn't feel incremental. The changes I've seen in the time that I've been into watches in the last 5 years have really outpaced everything that came before it. And China and what's possible in China is a big driver of that.
Right. I mean, so to use an example, right? Ceramic bezels, when they first came out, you could get black, right? And that was about it. And then when they started to come into the cheaper market, maybe you could get black and we could center a blue for you, but what about the red that Rolex uses? No one's figured out how to make red yet, except for Rolex with their Cerachron or whatever. But then give it a couple more years and it's been figured out. And it's almost like, the F1 market or the space market, all those technologies eventually trickle down into, I guess, common people, us, and we can reap the benefits of them and get to use them. Things that, no company would invest to figure out how to make that, but eventually, because someone else did, just became prolific and it's now available. And I want to ask you a question, right? So your $200 San Martin, what's the difference between that and a $2,000 watch with a different name on it that's a diver? Design aside.
I've thought about this. So let's compare another watch we have in the office today. We of course have several of them. I've got a GMT Master from Rolex on my desk here. I've got no shortage of Tudor Black Bays. So let's compare the San Martin Black Bay to the Tudor Black Bay.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely incremental differences in quality. Now, the Tudor Black Bay is going to cost just under $5,000. The San Martin costs well under $500. Is the Tudor Black Bay 90% better, however many times better?
Yeah.
No. It's not on a pure product level. No, right. It's not. There's some key differences. The movement is better. The finishing is a little bit better. The adjustable clasp on the Tudor is a little bit, but you could go on. It's incrementally better from just a pure product standpoint.
Right.
However, I was able to go to an authorized dealer and buy the watch. I didn't have to order it on Alibaba. I had a wonderful experience at the boutique doing it. I got to try on a lot of different watches. I had an informed and very helpful sales staff that helped me with it. Mm-hmm. If anything goes wrong with the watch, I know it's covered by an international warranty. I can take it back to that retailer or anywhere else and not have to worry about it. I also have all of the equity of the Tudor brand. And I don't just mean that from being a brand snob. Most people don't care about Tudor outside of the world of watches. But I have the equity of the promise that Tudor has made to stick around. Mm-hmm. I know that they'll be around in a year. I know that they'll be around in 50 years and probably 100 years. I have confidence that the watch will last that long. So I think, long way of saying, there are a lot of intangibles that contribute to that value. And I would still argue a Tudor Black Bay at under $5,000, all things considered, and not just brand and not even primarily brand,
right,
still represents a great value. And at a pure product level, the San Martin also represents a great value. It just depends on what you value.
Right. Well, I mean, and so majority of people in this world, well, definitely my customers, maybe not yours, value money. And they'd rather just get the San Martin because they're going to save the money. And I'm just feeding really back into the why Homage watches are so kind of, why so many people gravitate towards them. And that's pretty much the reason. Do you want to own one Tudor, or do you want to own, no one wants 25 San Martins, or maybe people do. I know people that own 20 Islanders. I can't believe it. But do you want to own 20 San Martins? And that's, it's a legitimate argument, and I understand it. I have watches going from $30 to, ashamed to say it. So, variety is the spice of life sometimes.
Listening to you guys talk, something is occurring to me, which came up also in some of the previous episodes. We are talking about this from a very wonky industry standpoint, which is not shocking because we're industry wonks. But we're forgetting, at least I'm forgetting in this conversation, that one of the fundamental differences between the watches we're talking about and, say, a Rolex or or a Tudor, I guess, or what have you, is the perception of what is a luxury good, right? And part of what's tied up in a luxury good is everything that Gabe just described, right? Around experience and promise and service, blah, 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 et cetera.
Yeah.
But if you take that away, Mark, and you apply the logic that you're applying, which is like, let's strip brand, let's strip experience, and let's strip luxury as an industry out of it and look at it purely analytically from a product construction standpoint. That's a really different answer than what we're all expecting, because I could sit here and get defensive about why my GMT Master is so great. And I could argue with you down to the minutia of like the detente on the GMT hand just feels like it, clicks in better.
Yeah, I get it.
Is that $10,000 better? That's all, whatever. That's if I think it is or I don't think it is. It's all part of me justifying it as a luxury good.
Right.
Fundamentally.
Right.
So I just wonder if maybe some of the ways to frame this up is they are, you have to think of them, or at least this is what I'm taking away. I have to think of these things as objects in their own right to compare against one another, but I can't really look at it through the lens of our industry and, collectives industry of like luxury.
No. Because
it's not an accurate way of looking at it. That's not what it is. And if I take that away, it does change how I perceive some of this.
Yeah, if you could get a Ferrari with no badging on it and it had a 4-cylinder 150 horsepower engine, would it sell?
Yeah.
It looks nice, right? It's a great looking car. It's not going to.
Look, man, I buy the majority of stuff that I feed my kids at Costco.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, though. It's like Kirkland is materially as good in many ways as every other name brand.
There's no arguing.
It's not luxury.
Made in the same factory as the name brand stuff.
Well, in many cases, it is the same stuff as the name brand.
Right. Well, I'm saying, but to your point before, also talking about, materials, finishes, there are brands now machining 904 for their watches. No one did that. No one did that. Rolex was the only one up until, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. It was, we can't machine it. It chips. It's hard to machine this and that. It's like tungsten. Well, all of a sudden now, people are doing it. So, yeah, it's almost like a self-feeding cycle, right? Because where do you go from here?
It's funny you mentioned that. When I was a kid, one of the first watches I ever lusted after was a fake Rolex. My brother, who's 10 years older than I am, entered the workforce when I was like in middle school. And we lived in New York City, and he was like a paralegal at some big fancy New York law firm. So he wanted to have a nice watch to wear to work. But obviously he was a paralegal fresh out of college and like couldn't afford a nice watch. So what did he do? He went to Bloomingdale's, which he did back in the day. And right outside of Bloomingdale's, there'd be these guys with briefcases.
I did the same exact thing.
Yep. And he bought a fake Coke GMT Master. This would have been in like the 90s. And
You might have bought from the same guy.
Probably did. Or there's a litany of guys doing this for a while. And I remember seeing that watch and just thinking the design of it was like the coolest thing. I didn't know what the the two-toned bezel was all about, but that black and red bezel was just like so cool.
Right.
And sometimes like he wouldn't wear the watch, when he wasn't going to work, he would like leave it in his desk drawer in his room, and I'd like open the desk drawer and like check out the watch. And I thought it was the coolest thing.
Right.
Now, one day he was riding the subway to work, and the watch spontaneously exploded. I mean, like the crystal popped off, the bezel popped, and he was like literally picking up the like pieces of the dial and case off the floor of the subway, and that was it for the watch. And that was kind of the state of replica watches.
Right.
I don't even know if it said Rolex or Folex on it.
Mine said Rolex. My dad had a hardware store on 2nd Avenue and 61st Street. So I was always in the city.
Now you're right around the corner.
Exactly. Bloomingdale's was one of his house accounts. And yeah, when I wanted one, we walked over and $20-$30, and I think it broke before I got home.
Yeah, there you go. But that was like the state of these watches, right? For a very long time.
Yeah.
And, Rolex or whomever could always say, well, sure, you could buy the fake thing, but it's just not well made. It's going to explode on the 6th train or on the way home. And that's just not true anymore.
Not at all.
And, it's a testament to how far the watch industry globally has come, where the floor has been raised to this new height. And I kind of wonder, because look, you made this point with Islander, you make watches that are homage watches to Seiko watches that have been out of production. You also have original designs. I have one of your waffle dial GMTs with the white waffle dial.
Oh, nice.
Love that.
Good choice.
Love that thing. Such a great watch. Where do you see this thing going in the next 5 years? We've come so far. Where do you see the world of homage watches going, as maybe the gap between what an homage watch offers and the real thing offers closing? Do you see them continuing to close the gap, or do you see something else happening?
I think the gap is almost closed at this point. There really isn't. Take the Swissness out of it, right? Or take the Germanness out of it. So, CO, country of origin, we're never going to duplicate or imitate, right? But actually, wait, scratch that. You ever see an Atelier Wen watch? It's a beautiful watch. I think they're really well made. But where are we going? I don't know. The bars are getting so close to one another. Besides brand distinctions, I'm not sure what there is anymore. And that's...
Yeah, I think it forces the Swiss, like we said, to up their game. But I also think it forces the Chinese OEMs to likewise, like Sam Martin's a great example. Oh, you've mastered the homage watch. Yeah. Congratulations.
Yeah. That's what I was getting at earlier, which is, all right, Mark, if we operate on the presumption of what you're saying, where let's assume for a minute, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but let's assume for a minute, everything is on the same playing field from a technical standpoint. Let's go back to the creativity side. All right. Atelier Wen offers a novel idea. That is indisputable to me. And like their case design, like all of that, it is unique to them. It is a novel idea. That to me is a really cool thing, because you're right. Like their bracelets are really nice. Like the overall aesthetic of that piece, I think is really cool. That is way more interesting to me as a collector than the homage thing. But if the homage thing was essentially the AAA baseball of watchmaking, now if they're in the major leagues, now now to me, what I'm looking to them for is like, let's see what you can do creatively. Barron's is a great example of this.
Right.
So this is a Chinese watchmaker that's making some absolutely insane pieces that I think, we can have the conversation about it, but I would qualify as probably horology. And
right.
I mean, they're doing it, at a fraction of what that would cost.
Certainly from a mechanical standpoint. Yeah.
And
Unreal.
I think that is really, really cool, because now you're right. We're really fighting over creative ideas. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I will. Okay. So I'll retract a little bit. Where have we not met movements? The homage industry, whatever industry you want to say, the affordables industry focuses on using Seiko movements and Citizen Miyota movements. The thinnest movement you can get on a grand scale at this point would be a Miyota 9015, which is actually thinner than the ETA 2824. But the ETA is from the 70s or the 80s, whereas the 9015 came out 20 years ago. We need, you look at Bulgari whoever's going to make a movement that's 2 millimeters thin. That's something you're never, well, I guess that's the next thing to duplicate, is to get down to those levels, because getting movement thinness in is something that dictates design, right? And there's going to be designs that you simply cannot do because you're using, a Seiko movement that's 8 millimeters thick.
I think that's a great call, which is, we've seen the gap close on cases, on bracelets, on finishing. But the one thing that and there are exceptions. Siegel is a great point. In fact, Asher, I've been thinking we should do an episode. I know we've talked about movements and where you can find value in movements, but I think we should do an episode just about like what it actually takes from someone who has done it to create a new movement. It's insane.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. That is the space to watch.
Yeah.
Marc, we can't thank you. Literally, we cannot thank you enough for joining us. It's a personal thrill for us to have you on the podcast. We have been fans of yours for the longest time, and we love that you are out there doing what you do. Thank you.
Nice.
We know it comes from a place of not just business savvy, and we take inspiration from you on that, but really a place of passion and creativity. So
yeah, and honesty, by the way, if folks, I'm going to plug your YouTube channel here. Wherever you are in your collecting journey, it's worth following the Long Island Watch YouTube channel. Not only is the content great, you're very candid and you're really honest there, and I really appreciate that, both just as an industry peer, but also just as a collector. So if you guys don't follow Marc, it's absolutely worth a follow on YouTube.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Well, speaking of which, thanks for listening. This is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And of course, you can find our guest, Marc Frankel, online at Long Island Watch. But you probably already knew that. And as we said, follow them on Instagram and YouTube, where you're going to get a ton of valuable content. Now, to get in touch with us with your suggestions, your feedback, or your questions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.